get going on. So before we, you guys have a problem with that? Before we get into that, we'll just go ahead and let the downtown parking plan, we'll go ahead and let you present and get that out of the way. And I don't mean it that way, but I mean, you know, we'll let you go ahead and get her done. Was that not part of, the plan, Zach?
I was thinking I had some time to think about it. No, that's okay. Well, I guess we'll go right into it. I don't know, do you have? There we go. Better get prepared here. I'm Zach James, I'm the planning director at the Southeast Ohio Planning Commission, and we'll be presenting kind of our summary of findings of our downtown parks and study that we prepared for City of Burlington and for Downtown Partners. And I'll let some of our employees here introduce themselves. They'll be coming up at some point and do the presentation, part of the presentation. So, what kind of introduce themselves?
Jared Lasser, Regional Planner at SCRPC, and did a lot of the work on mapping.
Can I have you come to the, they're not gonna hear you at home.
I'm Jared Lassiter, I'm Regional Planner at SCRPC. We personally worked a lot with mapping and data collection for this project here.
And I'm Emery Ellingson, also Regional Planner.
All right, I want to thank these guys. We put, as a team, we put a lot of time and effort into this, but these two guys in particular spent endless numbers of hours analyzing data, collecting data, actually analyzing data, and putting a lot of this document together. So I want to thank them. Real quick, I want to say thank you to, we had a task force that we organized to help kind of provide input as we went through this process. So thanks to the people who served on that. We had several city staff, the mayor, Downtown Partners, Greater Burlington Partnerships, and building owners, property owners, and those folks. I think we met 5 times, 4 of which happened to be for multiple hours, so thanks them for their time. And then everybody who participated, we had a lot of people that we talked to on the phone for interviews, or that we had respond via survey. So with that, hopefully.
Yep, it's slow.
What's that?
It's just slow.
Okay. Oh no, bro, good. And I can just give you if you want to do it too. I don't know if that would help.
I let the wrong group go first.
You just ruined everything. It's a big file, so. Alright, just give you the go ahead, or
Yeah.
there should be just a down arrow up on the top. You can just hit the down right there. Alright. So just so we can get, some of these first couple slides I presented back in October, but I know we invited planning and zoning commission members and DPI board members, so I wanted to go over some of these. Since we might have some new people, but also just to get your mind back up to speed as to some of the things we talked about. So the study area itself is generally the self-supporting municipal improvement district, the SMID boundaries. It's not exactly the same, but it's very close. And that's the red line that you see up there. And then we kind of split for different parts of the study, evaluated in different aspects. So we have the core area, which is the yellow boundary. And so that would be an area where there's more on-street parking, less off-street parking, higher density of buildings, higher density of use. Where the periphery, you have a little more off-street parking. That's where all the riverfront parking would be. Some larger parking lots, like at the library around River Park Place, the depot, and then buildings that are, there's some development there, but a lot more opportunity for future redevelopment in that area. Should I give this a shot? Or is it?
Yeah. It's just slow.
Okay. I can just tell you to go if that would make it go any
Yeah.
faster.
My daughter always says, wait for it, wait for it. I don't know why she does that.
Great for all our comparison slides.
Just slow still? Yeah. Okay. So,
It went through, okay.
oh, that's fine, okay. So, as I mentioned the previous time we were here, and I'll mention again, this is not the first time that parking has been studied in downtown Burlington, but it's been close to 20 years since the last time a real comprehensive study has been completed. There's been a few smaller ones in recent years. Some DPI members did kind of a signage survey, and we had an FCC student do a kind of some occupancy analysis, some of the things that we'll show, but it was really targeted to a few specific areas, so not nearly as comprehensive as the data that we looked at. And then, just to kind of highlight how this is kind of an ongoing issue, this is a clip from the Downtown Doings. It's kind of a local newsletter from the Chamber of Commerce back in, I think, 1974. And there was a line in there, parking. There's a subject that everyone has an opinion on. And so I wanted to highlight that because there's really no silver bullet for parking. I don't think anybody has this thing figured out to a science. People are always gonna be upset about certain things, people are gonna like certain things, and people are always gonna have an opinion on it, no matter what changes are made. So I just wanted to highlight that and address that and discuss that.
Downtown Dillons.
Let's try this again. I changed this slide a little bit. I believe last time it said a parking problem is a good thing, and I changed it because, or perception of a parking problem, perception of one means, is a good thing. And I changed it to say, means good things are happening. Oh boy. I don't necessarily need to go through, I can just talk about that one. And so what I mean by that, I had several quotes here that say, want to solve your parking problem, build a place nobody wants to visit. Any place worth its salt has a parking problem. The more parking, the less place. The more place, the less parking. Parking is important where the place isn't important. In a dull place, you want parking space right in front of where you're going. So all these things kind of address the same thing, that you want a place that is vibrant where people want to visit and want to go. And so if there's a parking problem, it means that things are happening, people want to be there, there's development going on, and there's something unique about that place. So whether or not there is a parking problem or not, we kind of address that later in the data in some of our review, but nonetheless, that means that good things are happening and that there's a lot of good improvements happening downtown. All right, the next one, I do have a map on here. I can start talking about it, but hopefully we can get this back up and so you can see it. Parking in downtown is different from parking in other areas. So I have, again, a couple quotes from Jay Jacobs, who's kind of a planning activist. I should say kind of, is a planning activist. And Donald Chuk, who's kind of the go-to expert on parking. And I'm just gonna pull out little bits and pieces of these quotes here from Jane Jacobs. Downtown packs so much into a compact space. And then Donald Chuk, because downtown packs so much into a small area, I'm gonna skip a little bit here, but people pay for parking and then walk to get there. And so I've highlighted some things that kind of build off of those quotes here. The picture on the left is from downtown Burlington, and the picture on the right is from Roosevelt Avenue. So, I mean, you can distinctly see a difference in these two photos, and that the one on the left is an area that was built 100 years ago, maybe even longer ago than that, where cars either weren't around or weren't very prevalent at the time. And so in this instance, we have a higher density of buildings. We have a lot of parking on street that's shared for everybody to use, where more modern design here, we have a really, an area that's really spread out, not very dense at all. Each individual place has its own dedicated parking. None of that's shared, it's all private parking. I mean, it's actually been segregated. You can't get from one parking lot to the other without going out onto a public space to get to it. So we have to understand that these are different areas and you have to think about them differently. All right. Do you want to try? Okay, you're doing it. That's probably the safe bet here. I keep blowing it up. So the first time I presented to you guys, we gave several examples, kind of comparing distances to parking and how long it takes to get from one place to the other.
How much for a new one? How much for a new one?
And I don't know if it helped. I do have these slides, but if you want to go the old fashioned way.
I'm tired
What's
of
that?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. All right, we can try that. I got two on a page, but, so instead of this thing blowing up every 2 seconds. you guys mind if I talk from here?
Go for it.
Okay.
Can you borrow his microphone so that
Yeah, absolutely.
we can get the?
Absolutely. So the first time we presented, we had several maps that showed different distances to different parking areas. And so I wanted to display that again, but I wanted to, I guess, highlight this from a little different perspective. Again, highlighting that downtown is a different place. So this is Coral Ridge Mall kind of overlaid on top of downtown Burlington. And it shows that the mall itself covers about 6 blocks of Jefferson from one end to the other, and then you even encompass the parking area. You're covering almost 2/3 of our study area here. And the reason I want to point this out, number one, is people will drive there willing to walk to go to different stores and walk that far, and then might complain about walking distances here. But I just want to reiterate on this slide again too, that this is a different space and designed at different times. So while people are willing to walk these distances, you know, at a mall like this, they may complain about that in an area that was just designed differently at, 100 years ago. Okay. So before we really start I'm going to turn it over to Jared and Emery here for a little bit, but before I do that, I just wanted to give a little more background on the study itself again, and what the need for the study, why we did this. I think it was really because whether or not there was a problem, there's at least a perception of problem, a lot of comments about issues with parking and challenges, but then also development and growth that's happening. So the Tama building in particular, at the time when we first came about 6 months ago, I think the Mr. Moto's, the Churchill Drug Building was being discussed. You have McConnell Lofts and several other changes. We'll really talk about that later. So I think that was kind of the reason why we were asked to do this. So just to give you a background, what Jared and Emery are really going to start diving into here in a minute is when we started looking at this, we were saying, what are we going to study and what do we need to evaluate? So some of those things are, what do we have as far as parking? I mean, how many spaces do we have and where are they? How's it being used? How many people are actually occupying the spaces and what times of day are they being used? And things like that. How's it being managed or being enforced? What are the time limits? So we need to understand these things. But also, what amenities support the parking? So once you park somewhere, you have to get out of your car and you walk. So what are the pedestrian facilities like when you get out of your car? What about lighting or landscaping of the parking areas? Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel safe? So we studied all those things. Oh, and signage. Do people know where the parking is actually at? Then we wanted to talk about and look at what development has happened in the past, but what's happening now and what could happen in the future, and how would that impact parking. And then one of the other things we really want to do is understand, what do the users think? What do the people who work down here, the people that visit here to go shopping, the people that live here, what do they think about parking? What are their opinions? What are their concerns? And that's where I'm going to turn it over and let Emery start talking a little bit about some of the information about what users think, and then get into some of the data that we collected and what that told us.
What about you, Dave?
I'm gonna leave that up to the IT guys to figure out.
Oh, there it goes.
We're good?
That's major
Okay, so just to get started, there wasn't a lot of public input for this project. We had an online survey, it was also made available in paper form, and we had 352 responses in about an 8-week period, so that was a lot of different opinions. And we also conducted 50 interviews with different downtown stakeholders to get more of a detailed perspective from different business owners, residents, and other users. Now, we just took 2 questions from the survey here to show you. First question we asked was, do you think there's a parking problem in downtown Burlington? And about 2/3 said yes, and then 23% said no, 10% was still unsure. And then the second question we asked was, in your opinion, are there any parking conflicts between basically the 2 big user groups, which are downtown visitors, so people come and shop, maybe go out to eat, the residents, and then employees. And again, we had a majority of people saying, yeah, I think there's a conflict. Now you can kind of see in the quotes, those are just general comments that we did get from the surveys. So as far as the parking problem, there was mentioned Sunday parking, not enough parking, signage is confusion, which came up a lot in the responses, which kind of ties into another comment, people being unaware of public lots and where they're located. And then again, on the other end, but the second question, insufficient for employees. Steamboat days came up a lot as well, as far as parking. That was a common theme. And then again, just kind of the conflict between, you have different users who have different needs from the parking spaces. So we go to the next slide. And to kind of illustrate this a little farther with kind of the contrast in opinions, there was 5 major issues that we saw a lot in the comments. And first was, in the upper left-hand corner, it's kind of a general concern about development, both residential and others. And a second is against signage. You can see different comments, better signage, not everyone wanted 3 lots. And a third big issue, which is, to me, this really shows the contrast in opinions, is you have some people saying, hey, let's take all those old buildings, let's knock them down, let's put parking. And then you have just as many people saying, you know, we need to conserve buildings where they are. So again, just showing the contrast. And then also too, with time limits, you get the same thing. Some people say, hey, this recent change, it's fantastic. I'm gonna go back to 2, maybe 3, let's get rid of them completely. So a lot of different opinions when it comes to parking. And just kind of a fun fact, 75% of the people that took the survey have lived in Burlington for 10 years or more. So definitely have kind of the long-term perspective on parking downtown.
This is kind of the master parking map that shows all of the existing parking resources throughout the study area. And you can see the darker shaded area in the middle is what would constitute the core, which is the most densely developed area of downtown, the Jefferson Street retail corridor included within that. So anything on here that's shown in blue is public parking. The dark blue lines represent on-street parking segments, and the light blue shapes represent off-street lots. And then the yellow represents private parking lots throughout the study area. And finally, if you look at the pie chart on the left, the little sliver of red represents anything that would either be county-owned or federal through the post office. So you can see some lots there by the sheriff's department and the courthouse. You can see there that there's a significant supply of public off-street parking along the riverfront. It really shows up when you look at it from this perspective. Not as much in terms of public off-street in the core, although you do have the parking deck at between 3rd and Main on Washington, which is 2 levels. And then you do have a fair amount of private lots around the edge of the core, and then as you get out into the periphery area. And then in addition, there's the tan color spaces mainly around the periphery, which we noted on here are not being regularly used for parking, but they're paved surfaces that are used for storage of various vehicles and equipment, which could potentially be used for parking, easily converted to that use, depending on future need. And if you look at the chart on the left, you can see that lists the total. There are just over 3,800 total spaces in the study area, of which 1,500 are within the core area. And the percentages for each type are fairly similar. The private tend to occupy somewhere around 1/4 of the total. The only difference is that the core area tends to be a higher concentration of on-street. In this case, there's 1,500. Actually, that's the total, I'm sorry. The total has 1,500 on-street spaces, whereas off-street is about 1,300. Whereas in the core area, it's 720 to 320 respectively. So there's much more reliance on the on-street parking in that particular area. And then this slide shows, specifically for the sake of how is the public city-owned parking enforced, what the regulations that are currently in place. So this shows both the on-street and the off-street public parking, with anything on there that's in the pinkish purple color represents free parking, where you can see, once again, the riverfront definitely stands out there. The blue represents 4-hour parking. 2-hour parking is in green, which you can see the Jefferson Street corridor clearly marked on there. And then anything that's in black is owned by the city, but it's restricted. For example, you have a couple of lots by the courthouse and the water department, as well as some of the on-street segments currently used by the police department. And then some of the off-street lots, as you will see, have slightly different regulations in place. For example, the parking deck is partially occupied by leased spaces where one person pays to lease that space over a monthly period and likely can renew that however many times to use that space. So the parking deck has about, I think it's almost 90 leased spaces, and then around 60 that are for general public use that's paid during the week. And then also there's the lot at 6th and Washington, which is, there's only a few leased spaces in there, but the majority of it is public access. And then in terms of there's a couple of ones that are in green by Main and Valley, and then 4th and Valley, which are city-owned, but they're entirely composed of leased spaces. And then lastly, you can see we try to differentiate between the diagonal angled spaces on street and parallel, so that the segments of diagonal obviously fit in more spaces per block than parallel. So this just gives you an idea of the total amount of parking that the city owns and how it's regulated at this time. As part of this overall study, we looked at several other components. We're not going to go into detail here, but they're included in the full study report. We analyzed signage as kind of a big issue. We encountered a lot of people that were confused by the signage. So we looked at both public and private signage, comparing those resources, seeing what's out there, and just compiling an inventory of that. We looked at pedestrian issues and the distribution of handicap spaces throughout the study area. One thing of note is that there are a number of significant obstacles in the way of, like you can see pictured here, there's a parking area along the riverfront which is separated from downtown by the off and on ramp onto Highway 34. There's also the railroad tracks, main railroad line, as well as the short line. And then also in the northern part of the study area, you get a lot of topographic relief as you go up the hill there. So there's definitely, we talked earlier about how the downtown it's the same footprint as like a major regional mall, but it's complicated by the fact that some areas there's issues because of the more rugged topography as you're going up the hill. So those are important issues to keep in mind. We looked at lighting in terms of if people will more likely to park in a place where they feel safe, particularly after hours when it's dark. And we noticed that there's a definite discrepancy from one lot to another in terms of the city's off-street lots, in terms of how much lighting is available. In some cases, there's plenty of lights both on street and within the interior of the lot. Whereas in other cases, it can be lacking, and there's a larger distance from the nearest light to illuminate that particular lot. And then we also looked a little bit into bike infrastructure, trying to emphasize alternative transportation options for those that choose to do so, both people in terms of people visiting downtown as well as residents, and just evaluating what can be done to make sure that amenity is adequately provided as an alternative to maybe take away some of that excess demand for parking.
So a big part of this and a lot of kind of conclusions are talking about how people utilize parking. This came from data we collected. We went on a Thursday in October, and about 6 or 7 of us covered downtown, and we monitored each parking space in the downtown area to see if someone was parked there or not. And so using this data, we've created a couple maps. Now this first one, this shows the occupancy. So this means over the span of a day, how often how often someone's in that space. So if you see 0% of the time, basically 0 to 25% of the time, those are what the colors indicate. So you can see all day, as indicated, the all day average occupancy was 34% for the whole downtown area. So that means 34% capacity being used. One thing you can kind of notice is along the riverfront, pretty low percentages, middle lot is a little bit higher, but as far as the all day is concerned, you don't really see any areas above 75%. You see a couple. So this kind of shows that a lot of the parking spaces, there's still capacity. Okay, and then we also do this on each hour, so you can kind of see how it breaks down throughout the day. So this is 8 a.m., people still coming to downtown, maybe getting to work, and you can see it's generally low across the downtown area. Again, you can see pretty low on the riverfront, and there's even a lot of areas when you get into the periphery where there's no one parked at all. So then you just have an empty street. Go to the next one. And again, 1 p.m., you're up to 37% capacity, occupancy for the area. And now you do start to notice there are some areas that are starting to be stressed. So you do see kind of the red popping up where there aren't any available spaces on that particular part of the block. But one thing I'd like you to look at is if you notice some of these red areas, there's a blue area right around the corner, which shows that maybe on this face of the block, I can't park here, but around the corner there's available spaces. And another thing too, is if you look at the parking deck, which is, you see the P, which indicates the police station, it's right there, that's at a low percentage in the 20s. So you have a lot of spaces going unused. I think for that hour, it's around 25%. And when the deck is 25% full, that means there's still about 80, 90 spaces that are unused in the center of downtown. So that's a lot of unused spaces.
Are you trying to tell us that people don't like to park around the corner in Burlington? Is that what you're
Well, I
saying?
think it's not that, it's not, you're not used to looking, you know, you're going to this store, and this is where I'm going, and you don't see it. Or when we're talking, when you go to the mall, you just keep driving down the road, and you see it.
I think that's, I think that goes to prove how important signage is going to help out.
Definitely.
I think it may also say that there was enough space or enough spots right up front where somebody could find it, where it got to capacity where nobody necessarily needed to go
Right on,
around it.
right on.
Could be that, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
there's a couple different ways you could think about it, or what it could be.
you know, you can see a lot up and down Jefferson Street, a lot of those are full, because a lot of the shops are right there, so that's kind of the focus point where you're looking at. And that's another thing too, is when we did the hourlies, you can definitely see, it's kind of funny, like you can see at noon, all of a sudden it moves from kind of around F&M Bank, it all jumps over to Jefferson Street, so everyone's going to lunch. You can kind of flip through the hours. We only had 3 different ones here, but you can see the patterns. So we're gonna go to the next slide. And again, we took it at 5 p.m. as well, so this is, you know, work days winding down, and you see a lot of blue, so a lot of empty spaces. Up by River Park Place, so you do notice, it's pretty high, so that's actually 100% on one side, but again, on either sides of the park, we still have about 50% capacity available. So that's the occupancy for the day. So again, you kind of see the overall never goes above 40%. So there's a decent amount of parking available. Now part of that, the reason why those numbers are the way they are, is there's a lot of parking on the riverfront that goes unused during the day. So that does have the tendency to bring that number down a little bit.
And also south of the tracks, a lot of that
Yeah.
doesn't get used.
So, but also in the study, there's also a page where we do break down the downtown area into different sections. We have the riverfront as its own category, south of the tracks, kind of the civic area by the courthouse. And so you can take a look at that if you're really curious and kind of more localized perspective on that. So, next slide. Another thing we looked at was turnover analysis, and so this is how many times in a day a spot turns over. So how many different cars are utilizing each space. And so it goes from some spaces we actually never use for a full day as we were monitoring them, and some spaces up to 6 times a day. So a lot more of that turnover you see definitely in the Jefferson Street corridor, where you have a lot of people coming in, maybe going out to lunch, going shopping, they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out. then some of the longer terms, you see the longer term parking occurring in a lot of the off-street lots. So that's more probably employees coming or maybe a resident. So especially, you see the deck, again, riverfront lots, go to right across the street from the Burlington Apartments, residential parking. And so that's kind of where you see more longer term parking.
And a number of those are private as well.
Yeah.
I would point out too, up at River Park Place, where you have a lot of uses. I mean, it's kind of a private entities, but a lot of, let's say, well, you got some educational things going on there. You have the Chamber of Commerce there, we get a lot of meetings, a lot of turnover, so.
And there's kind of that
people
shift
coming
at
in
the
and
end, that shift at the end of the day where Martini's opens up and then that traffic filters in and then the daytime workers come out.
So you can kind of see how, this just shows you how different spaces are used. So go to the next slide. And then the third thing we looked at was duration. So we got capacity, and then we had turnover, which is again, how many times the space is used. This map shows, well, how long are those people staying in the spaces? And again, you have some spaces that are never used, and then some maybe you have your shorter trips, which again, you can kind of see Jefferson Street sticking out between 2 to 3 hours. And then you do also see kind of the longer term parking, which happens again with the off-street lots and then kind of areas in the periphery too. So, yeah. So again, with, you have residents, they might be parked there longer. And then also too, actually, in some spaces on Jefferson Street, the duration is actually longer than the regulation. So you can kind of see that people, they're parking against whether they know the regulation or they're just gonna bet they don't get a ticket. In some cases, on some parts of that block, the duration.
And that's average, so that
Yeah,
has
it's
to be several
average.
people.
So it can be a couple people. So they might have got tickets too, we can check windshields, so. So there's a lot of different data to look at here, so if you're trying to figure out for a certain area, you can see it here. Next slide. And again, we also did an overnight occupancy analysis, so we went out on a Tuesday night at 10 p.m. and did the same thing we did for the daytime occupancy. And as you can see here, very low, overall 10% occupancy for the whole downtown area. But what does stick out is the area around the Burlington Apartments. I should also note, sorry, all the purple dots are residences. So those are all the residences in the downtown area. And you can see the area around the Burlington Apartments does have a higher occupancy rate because again, even though a lot of those residents do park in the off-street lot, a lot of them also park on-street. And then also too, the area around the paddle wheel, that did have higher occupancy, and there are some residences in the second story, but again, some of that could have been due to bar traffic, so. But we thought 10 p.m. provided a pretty good snapshot of the way cars are parked at night.
And I notice how also a lot of the off-street lots are either empty or close to empty,
So,
and including the deck.
Well, I,
oh, sorry.
I was gonna say you can see right around the Burlington Apartments where it's orange, so 75 to 80% occupied on street. Well,
I think most of those, it was just there was one space that was open on the block.
and then you look at the off-street lot at Main and Valley, which is almost entirely dedicated to the residents of that building, and it was under 50% occupied. So more of those people, even though they have the spaces dedicated off-street, they're parking on-street.
Yeah, that's lease parking, and actually, almost the entire lot is all leased to the residential people at Burlington, and there's 4 made available for the public. Yeah, so they're paying and then choosing. to
Even
park
though
on
they're
street.
paying for it, they're choosing to park on the street.
It's closer to the entrance.
December, so. And then we also did, within the study, there's also a page on Sunday parking as well, because that came up again in some of the surveys, that Sunday parking is quite an issue, so, that's in the survey.
So next, we're gonna look at, highlight some of the specific lots and this time shown in graph form to illustrate the change in occupancy throughout the day. And so we're gonna start off with the lots on the 500 block of Valley, which rather timely because that has just recently been changed. Before we completed the study, before that, the lot on the east side was changed to a pay lot. So at the time we did the study, it was a pay lot next to a free lot, and we could easily tell from the data we collected that for the most part it was people were intensively using that free lot until it was full, and only once you got to that point did anyone start to utilize the paid lot next to it on the west side of the block by Nancy Neefy Park. In fact, that image on the top was conveniently enough taken from Google Maps, and you can see it's the very stark dichotomy between how intensively full that free lot on the east side is compared to the other side, which the only vehicles you're actually seeing in the back of that lot are on that back portion, which is privately owned, and so it's part of the same lot, but it's part of a different property. So the 20 public spaces, it's not being used at all. So you can see an aerial view of those lots on the image below. So on the graph, the blue represents the paid lot on the west side. The red represents what was then a free lot on the other side of the block, and then the black represents all of the on-street segments, which was basically the south side of Jefferson to the north there, and then on the west side of Fifth. And so you can see that the paid lot never goes above 20% occupied, whereas the free lot is usually somewhere between 80 to 100% occupied, and then it drops off after 3 o'clock when when the workday ends and people's shifts end, and it's gradually empties out to about 40% at the end of the day. And then for on-street, you can see a clear peak right around lunchtime where it picks up gradually from the morning. There's the peak, and then it drops sharply back down again. So you can clearly see there that there's a pretty much strategic avoidance of that paid lot until everything else is exhausted in the area.
As Jared's talking here, I do want to interject. It's mentioned that this lot has changed recently. There was a decision, the council made this lot a paid lot
Yeah,
close
it was
to
a
2
long time.
years
There was a
ago.
resolution.
And a year or two ago.
Is about 2 years ago, and before striping was done and they did the transition, they needed to get another box to put that in, and it got lost in the process somewhere and didn't get done. And it finally did get done here in the last couple of months, so I assume that there's a potential that you have received some phone calls recently, or may here in the not-too-distant future, from some folks who aren't necessarily pleased with that change, because you see the dynamics that he's mentioning here. That lot has had a high usage as a free lot, but you did make a decision here a couple of years ago, and it's not that you can't revisit and make a change, but you have made a change in the past that is now finally having an impact, and it's caused some level of discussion. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Change usually does, but I did give them your phone number. Jim,
Thank you.
just so you know.
Well, that's the last on that particular slide. We can move on.
Can I just comment about that? The only email I've got about that, Jim, is the way that the people pay for that. It just seems like they're not very happy about how it's done. And,
With the slots. And,
yeah, so I don't know if there's some better way to handle that, or.
and that's one of the recommendations that's in the study near the end. And you may think about that as he gets to the recommendations at the end, because one of the first bullet points that they have on that relates directly to your comment here.
Okay, next we looked at focus directly on the issue of leasing of spaces within public parking lots. And in that case, you have 2 lots, the one at 4th and Valley across from McConnell Lofts, and then the Main and Valley lot, which is coordinated with Burlington Apartments. Those are either all or almost entirely all leased to individuals. And then you also have the parking deck where slightly more than half of that is leased, and then the remainder is for general public use. So we looked at just the day-long occupancy of the leased portions of each one of those lots, which is not shown on the maps, but this graph here shows the overall occupancy of those three separate leased facilities. And you can see there that even though I believe our data shows that most all of those are actively leased, someone holds a lease to those lots right now, you'll see that none of them ever cracks above 60% occupied during the workday. And even the one that's the most highest occupied, Fourth and Valley, is slightly, you'll notice, it's about 10% higher than the other two. And one thing that I'll point your attention to is you can see by the shape of that graph that both the parking deck, the portion of the parking deck that's leased, and the lot at Fourth and Valley are consistent throughout the day, and then there's a big drop off after
5 o'clock.
3. So you can clearly see that the majority of usage of those two leased lots are leased by people who are employees downtown, and so it ends up emptying out by the end of the day. Whereas the Main and Valley lot is pretty much hovers right around 40% all day, and so those are indicates that those are residents there, and so we'll have people with different shifts, so it ends up averaging out to being about 40% full throughout the day. And lastly, we just wanted to look specifically at the deck because it's the most significant concentration of off-street parking within the core of downtown that's publicly owned. And so this case, the last slide we looked at the leased parking. Now we're looking at the 60 public spaces in that lot which are available for general use. And so the graph at the bottom, the blue represents the 60 public spaces within the deck. The red represents, it doesn't really show up perfectly on this image, but those are basically the on-street blocks that are right around the deck. So both sides of the 200 block of Washington, the blocks of Third that are immediately around Washington, and then also the block of Main between Washington and Jefferson. So you take all those on-street spaces together, that's what's represented by the red. And then the black represents all other off-street parking that's within that red oval on the map. So it's it's basically a block and a half radius around the deck. So you can see there that that throughout the day, the highest usage rate is the blocks that are right around the deck. And sometimes it gets almost up to 90%. It drops off at lunchtime, peaks up again around mid-afternoon, and then drops off again. Whereas the deck that's right next to it never cracks above 12% occupied for those 60 spaces. And so that shows that there's a critical issue there, that people are able to use those lots. It's available to them, but they're choosing to, the on-street parking nearby gets clogged up very quickly, and that deck is still sitting there at under 20% occupancy. So next slide.
Is there a reason, are we still paying for that deck? Is that why we charge that, or is it just help out with other expenses, or how does it work?
All right, well, and this kind of gets covered in here too, revenues. We have a charge system in there for the hourly, and that's on the top deck is pretty much all hourly. It's not all, some of it's leased now. And then the lower part is all leased on a monthly basis. It all goes into the parking fund. That parking fund at this point has not been able to be, even though it's pointed out in the study, it talks about the last 3 years, has had a significant positive cash flow.
Historically.
But if you go back to 2012, that was an account that was, I think, 260,000 deficit.
Right.
They mentioned that 60,000 went in this last year or was going in this year. I think both are true. We have to still transfer money in there just to get back to zero. At the end of this fiscal year, we should be to where that fund is at a $0 amount, where it's out of the deficit or category. And then you'll be in a spot where you can talk about using that for some of the solutions. And as you mentioned, solutions for what do you do for a different pay system? Some of those are electronic pay boxes. Do you start talking about putting electronic pay boxes in different places? And then you're talking about that as a purpose for why you have a charge system in there for that. But there's some different philosophies for different things that can be done. And I don't know how far you go into talking about alternative charging systems for different uses, different places as you get to the end.
I don't know if we talk about it a lot here. There's some interesting dynamics here too. I mean, the way, and I don't want to jump ahead too far here, but, I guess you actually get it back on. I just took the remote. Sorry. But what Jim was saying, Jim Davidson was asking about whether it's free or not. And so there's an interesting dynamic here because really where the demand is the on-street free spaces.
Right.
And where you're paying is off-street. So there's kind of this interesting dynamic there. Why is it free on where the higher demand is and cost off the street?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's what, go ahead.
And
Sorry.
we don't really address that too much in our proposals. What we really look more at is, are there things we can do with the on-street with hourly restrictions first? And do some other things off-street.
Based on the areas where there's the highest demand for.
Yeah, so
on-street.
like with this place, really do more on awareness, because we talked to several people that don't even realize they can park there.
Some people have thought it's related to the police department, and I think part of that may have to do with the fact that the enforcement vehicle is parked up there for off hours, which people see that and they think.
Signage, man, signage. But
So I don't wanna jump too far ahead, because we still have more things to do, but a lot of the things we're gonna talk about are really more about better awareness of where people can park, and maybe doing some time restriction type things on the street to try and get better utilization. But long-term, it may have to be where you flip things around, where something like this becomes free and on-street becomes charged. But then you start talking maybe some bigger investments and pretty drastic changes. So we're looking for smaller improvements, less cost upfront.
You have a couple of other dynamics that'll go into that. The TEMA building is gonna be looking for places for their residents. But then as you start talking about what are the options that are available, this is one of the locations that is available for them, and they've requested a discussion about leasing a lot of that upper deck. But we've held off on them, wanting to talk about parking in a larger scale, and do you wanna start talking about, leasing strategies on some of these lots, some of them being a daytime hours lease, having a fee for that, having a nighttime lease arrangement, and then some that are, or having a third option that's a 24/7 lease arrangement. And I don't know that I've seen a tremendous amount of usage of something like that around the country, but if you're trying to figure out a way to maximize usage, somehow marrying up these lots that are used only during the daytime with other locations that could, or with other tenants that could look at using those same spots in the off hours so that you get maximized usage on it. I just don't know what the mechanism is to get it turned over, but.
And we will talk about that a little bit more, so.
Okay, so, the next series of slides we'll go through this pretty quickly, but it's a comparison. We went to the same exact location, trying to get as close to the same vantage point each time to compare what the occupancy looks like in the middle of the day as opposed to evening. So it's usually, the daytime are usually taken around noon, and the evening usually taken around 6 or 6:30 last fall. So this one here shows the lower level of the parking deck, which I believe there's a small row of spaces along Washington Street that are public, but the rest of them are leased. So in this case, you don't really see a whole lot of difference, except there's a few vehicles in the middle row on the daytime image that aren't there in the evening. So you can see it emptying out pretty clearly. And And then that goes along with the data we have, which shows that most of the people leasing spaces in there are daytime employees. Next, okay. Here's the upper level of the parking deck. You pretty much see the same exact pattern here, and most days it's usually the same thing here, where you have the enforcement vehicle and maybe one or two other vehicles there that lease, that have it there during the evening, and that's usually about it. Next. Here we have an area that has a lot of demand during the day. This is Court Street in between 3rd and Main. This has a lot of employees at the courthouse, as well as members of the public visiting the courthouse, park along that stretch there, and so you see it pretty much, it's a complete ghost town during the evening. There's really no generating demand around there for residences or anything else. So this is pretty much exclusively used very intensively during the day, and then pretty much empty other times. Next. This is a private lot that is this is actually right across from City Hall. This is owned by the same person who owns the Riverview Business Center, which has a number of offices across the street, and there's an arrangement there where people who are employed at that in that facility can park in this lot. So you can see there that it pretty much empties out in the evening, but even during the daytime, you'll notice it's not quite all the way full, so that even with all the people who regularly park there, you have the question of, is there a way we can encourage greater occupancy during the day if it's not getting fully utilized, especially such a large lot right in the middle of a high demand area. Next. Here we have the permit only lot in front of the courthouse. This is on county property. There's a small row of public spaces close to the building, but what you're seeing here is pretty much all employee parking, and you can see it once again pretty much all empties out, save for a couple of trucks at the end of the day, so that one's pretty clear. Next. Here we have a very high demand area along Jefferson Street. This is right near the Tama building. You can see there it's pretty consistent day and evening. There's a lot of demand in that area. Significant occupancy, maybe slightly more during the daytime, but you'll notice more people park there during the evening than some of the other places we've seen. Next. Here's a little bit further down on Jefferson Street, and this, the one on the right isn't quite as clear based on the reflection there, but this block in between, I think that is 4th and 5th, or 5th and 6th, you can see that there's a lot of demand in the middle of the day. That's near Ivy Bake Shop, which generates a lot of demand in that area. But once you hit the evening, that block, I've seen this several times, but that particular block, there really isn't anything going on there, so that one empties out pretty well at the end of the day. Next. Here's probably one of the highest demand areas consistently throughout the day, the block of 3rd Street, which is right by the Capitol Theater, Burlington Apartments, and F&M Bank. So there you can see it's pretty much the same. They're pretty much almost full day or evening. There's a lot of different uses around there that generate demand, and then you have a lot of residents that are utilizing those on-street spaces. Next. Here is right around the corner from there, looking east onto Valley, where it's kind of near Martin Grover is across the street. On the left side is the Burlington Apartments, and again there you can kind of see it actually seems to be more demand a little bit during the evening after you have people in the apartments returning home, parking on street in that area. Next. And here we're also in the same vicinity to the south. This is in front of Napoli's, looking to the south on 3rd, where once again it's pretty much even demand during the day and evening. There's probably a lot of demand specifically related to that restaurant around dinner time, and then you also have some residents in that area as well, most likely. Next. Here is the 4th Street, right near McConnell Lofts. There's the private, the city lease lot across the street from there. In this case, you can see it pretty much empties out by evening time. There's a lot of demand during the day. There is the restaurant right there in the McConnell Building, and a lot of spillover from visitors and employees off of Jefferson Street because of the 4-hour parking. But again, not a lot of demand from residents on that particular block at evening. Next. Here is the aforementioned off-street lot that is, as of now, entirely leased. You can see, based on the data we showed you earlier, it was never more than 60% occupied. So you can see there that it's about 2/3 full during the day, but even though they're leased, there's still a few empty spaces. And then at night, there's usually no more than 2 or 3 vehicles ever in there at night. So you can see that that one is really only getting utilized during the daytime. Next. Now we get to another area that has a lot of demand throughout the day, this time for different reasons, at different times of the day. This is near River Park Place, looking west on High Street at the north end there. You can see that they recently did some work on the sidewalks there when these images were taken, but that's an interesting block because it's one of the few places where the parking is arranged perpendicular to the street as opposed to being angled. So there's a lot of vehicles, a lot of capacity in that area. You can see during the day, you get a lot of people using the various tenants of the River Park Place. You can see some of the vans at the radio stations, and then evening you get a lot of demand from the restaurant around there. Next. This is the lot that's currently used by US Bank at the southeast corner of Valley and Main. This will eventually be used for the police department, but you can see when it's used for bank parking, it pretty much empties out entirely at the end of the day. Usually with those private lots, they'll have a thing that says that it's 24-hour enforced, but it pretty much empties out at the end of the day because of that, and then you have an empty lot sitting there overnight. Next. Here is an F&M lot. It's to the south of Napoli. It's a fairly large lot where you enter off of the alley, and that's largely for employees of the bank. And that's another one where it usually isn't even fully occupied during the day, but it's got a decent amount, and then it empties out, save for a handful of vehicles in the evening. Now we're on the far west end of downtown. This is the so-called 48-hour lot. It's the one a lot of people don't know about. It's behind the former Expert Tire and Sickles Laundry building between 7th and 8th off of Jefferson. And so that one really doesn't get a whole lot of utilization at any time, even though it's free. There's certainly a number of issues which we go into the report just based on the fact that you have that adjacent private lot where they're storing a number of truck trailers and other equipment, and then just the overall aesthetics of that lot. It doesn't get used a whole lot here, so you can really just see a handful of vehicles at either time. Next. Here we get some of the issue with the railroad tracks, how there's a lot of parking to the south of the tracks, but because the frequency of trains coming through there, you don't really have a lot of people parking on one side willing to walk to the other for their destination. So most of the utilization in this area tends to be associated with the Department of Human Services and the former Tom's Market building. In this case, because there's such a significant amount of parking off-street anyway, and only part of that space is being utilized, for the most part, the on-street parking on 5th doesn't get used at all. And so you can clearly see that there's nothing going on at either time. And you'll also notice that there was a train going through at both of those times, which just helps illustrate the frequency of that. Next. Here is the somewhat unusual situation underneath the 34 bridge, just to the west of the short line, where you have a number of people that like to park in the shade underneath the highway there. It's unusual because a lot of the none of the spaces are marked, people kind of just orient themselves around the posts holding the highway there, the bridge there, so, but you can see that there still is demand for that, and there's a few vehicles still there during the evening, so it's definitely something that people like to use. Now we get to the riverfront itself, where this is the riverfront lot in between Memorial Auditorium and the Port of Burlington, where you get a lot of, I think in this case, there's a bank that a lot of their employees park there, a number of other employees on the east side of downtown park in that lot and then walk to work. So that's the most consistently utilized riverfront lot during the day, and by the time you get to evening, it's emptied out for the most part. There's a few people left, but there's always possible that that has something to do with something going on at the port, or possibly even the Drake Restaurant being about a block away, so you can clearly see the distinction there. Here is the lot to the north of the Port of Burlington, where you've got a number of, it's pretty well utilized during the day, but that's mostly, the further you tend to get north of there, it gets less utilized, because you're getting farther and farther away, walking distance from potential locations, and the fact that there's the barriers in place because of the railroad and the on-ramp. And you can see there's still a few vehicles around in the evening. That tends to be a popular spot for accessing the river, for boats going in. I've noticed when we did our study, there tends to be a lot of people that just like to go down there and wait in between appointments. They just like to sit there by the river in their car. So that's you'll notice that quite a bit.
People may have been down there in the daytime to see the Trump bus. That day.
You can see it on the north. That's not the day that he was actually here, but must have been some kind of scouting ahead of time.
We checked, he wasn't there.
A lot of people do like to use the river to think, though. I know a lot of people that go down to the river to think. So.
Right. Here is the lot south of Memorial Auditorium. That gets a significant amount of employees during the day, and once again, pretty much empties out, save for a handful of vehicles in the evening. And here we have the extreme southernmost lot with the south boat launch entrance there, and this lot gets very little utilization. I think I saw one person who actually walked all the way up to work someplace on the east side of downtown, but other than that, it was only people accessing the river, and then nobody else utilized it. So this is pretty much used as overflow parking. It rarely gets utilized to any significant extent. So that's it for the day and evening comparison, which tried to give you a comprehensive view all around the downtown area. As we start to transition here, we wanted to give special focus to the fact that this study is not only looking at current conditions downtown, but trying to get a feel for what the situation is going to be like in the coming years when new developments take shape and the downtown transforms based on those changes. So first we looked at just the basic demographic data. So if you use the census blocks, which are the smallest unit of measurement for census data in the decennial census, we were able to approximate the full extent of downtown with a little bit of bleed over into the North Hill and South Hill neighborhoods, but kind of just that transition area. And when we just compile those same blocks for that same area for each decade from 1990 to 2010, you see that there's a significant increase. It went from about 120 residents in 1990 to 230 in 2010, which it's still a very small number comparatively to the city as a whole, but that represents a 90% increase. Initially, a lot of that was driven by the conversion of the former Burlington Hotel to the apartments, but it actually did increase slightly during the 2000s as well. We've had a number of the upper story residential conversions. So that's, again, it's a fairly small number, but it shows that there's an upward trajectory there that based on recent and ongoing projects for residential development, that's only going to increase in the future, most likely. And that's significant also because of the fact that it contrasts with what's going on in the population of the surrounding neighborhoods, shown by those adjacent census tracts, as well as the city as a whole, which is gradually detracting in population. And then also, who's living downtown? As an example, we looked at the age breakdown of those census blocks for 2010, and we can see there that there's a distinct tilt toward younger residents, particularly the 20 to 34 age range. For downtown, that constitutes almost 40% of the population, whereas the city as a whole, it's only about 18%. And then also the 50 to 64 empty nester, early retiree age range, it's relatively consistent with downtown, or with the city as a whole. Whereas the other three groups, 19 and under, 35, 49, and then seniors, 65 and older, get significantly less than the rest of the city. So that shows you that you're definitely dealing with a consistent demographic for a downtown, a lively downtown environment where you have that 20 to 34 and 50 to 64 well represented in the residential population. So that's where we're at right now, at least in terms of the 2010 census. Next slide, please. This is, there's a lot going on here, but we wanted to try to show comprehensively all the different activities that are going on or that are about to go on that will change the dynamic of land use in the downtown area. There is some information in the study itself which deals with current land use, but we just wanted, for this presentation, we wanted to highlight just that there really is a lot of things going on. Depending on scale, some of those are a lot smaller scale change than others. So we tried to illustrate, draw attention to particular things like, so all of the colored circles represent some kind of change or possibility for a change in the coming years. Anything that has a black dot in the middle represents something that could have a residential component to it, and anything with an X represents some kind of restaurant or bar, something that would, and both of those uses would likely generate a consistently high demand for parking. So you can see a number of these are comparatively smaller, particularly the yellow represent more long-term items where there really isn't any formal development proposal on the table yet, but it's sort of just a possibility that's out there for when the land is fully developed in the core. But this accommodates things like the Tama building, the possible development of the Churchill building. Anything with an arrow shows where something is moving. Like you have the police department will be relocating to the US Bank building. And there's some law offices that are relocating. So this just shows you that there's quite a bit of activity going on, and it's important to consider these implications these things may have and to monitor conditions into the future and not just rely on the data we have for today, because these are likely to have a significant impact over time once those take shape. So before we get to a handful of the specific solutions, we want to kind of just summarize what are some of the main takeaway points from this intensive study that we've undertaken here. So just go through those here. The first thing that really underlies everything is that although there is a perception of a parking problem in a number of angles, and as you will see, there's definitely reasons for that being the case, overall, under the normal circumstances, the current supply of parking is sufficient for the current demand, but there's a number of factors that are complicating that, and that's what a lot of our solutions relate to, trying to fix that issue so that you get better utilization of the parking. First, as we've already explained, there's a persistent lack of awareness of existing parking facilities, particularly off-street. People just don't know where it's located at, and they don't want to spend the time looking around when they have somewhere they want to go. They're going to look for wherever they can find it. If they circle the block a few times and they can't find anything, they'll just park on street further away, even if there is a city, an off-street lot that happens to be right there. So, and a lot of that relates to things like signage and marketing awareness of what's out there. Next, there does tend to be an issue where people tend to just view things from their own perspective and don't really think about how different users in the downtown environment have to interact to fully utilize the space. And so people only viewing things from their own perspective. There's like the particular user groups, for example, people who are employees who park on the street and consistently do that even though there's significant demand for their customers, and so that can have a negative effect where the customers think there's not enough parking because of that. Same for residents who, even if they have off-street parking, sometimes will park on the street because it's closer, and then that has an impact on other users. So there needs to be, at the present time, there really isn't very consistent cooperation between different groups to solve these issues. And what relates, at this next point relates to that a lot, is the idea of the 24-hour parking ownership, which is still very ingrained in a lot of people's minds in Burlington, mostly based on the fact that for many years there was an oversupply of parking and there wasn't a whole lot of activity, new economic development going on, so people were comfortable with what they had and people didn't really have to spend much time thinking about what was out there. Now we're kind of reaching that point where, because of the new development that's going on, people are starting to notice that there's a lack of parking here or there for whatever reason, and maybe it's time we need to start thinking about ways to share this parking supply more adequately so that different times of day, people with different demands at different times of day can utilize the lots, and so they're not just sitting vacant half the time. As we've also stated earlier, there's the misperception about walking distances. People react if they can't find a spot right in front of the building where they want to go. They act like it's a big deal when it may in fact be, there might be parking right around the corner. So just addressing that fact of what makes downtown unique and how sometimes you're just going to have to be willing to walk a block or two to get there, and that should be a realistic expectation. There's also the issue of, which seems to be the case, where people tend to avoid paying for parking wherever that's the case. So as we've seen from some of the low utilization rates on those paid lots. Also, we have the issue where solo driving dominates, where you have, particularly in the case of employees, you have people with the same shifts at the same business that drive their own vehicles from home, and then each person takes up a whole space, wherever that may be, on or off street. And so really, what we could see from that is there's definitely potential for alternate activities, particularly carpooling, getting people with the same schedules to try to coordinate so that they're not taking up quite as much parking during the day. Also, we've addressed briefly, there's been some pedestrian issues in terms of there's some places where, because of the topography, it's more of an effort to walk a few blocks than others, and in some cases you still have accessibility issues, like there's some stairways here and there on some of those steeper hills, and then there's also some of those rail and highway barriers. And another issue is the major events like Steamboat Days. We've gotten a number of complaints about that and how that tends to be a stressful time because of the strong demand, because most of the year there's not really an issue, but when it gets to those high demand events, it becomes a big problem. So those are current conditions that can help explain some of this sense that there's a parking problem. But it's also important to consider the impacts of future changes. First, the fact that we've got a lot going on in development right now, with a lot more expected in the near future, and those would need to be monitored to make sure how those are actually going to affect the overall demand, and in particular residential, which really presents a unique situation where you've never really had this many residents in the downtown area. Trying to coordinate where they park is going to be an important thing to consider. So overall, that means we have several key conclusions here as a reaction to these conditions. One, that new solutions we need to be thinking proactively rather than reactive to existing problems. Because in general, that seems to be the case. It's kind of just an instinct to try to see a problem and fix that problem. But as the next point mentions, you need to emphasize a little bit more to actually address things comprehensively, which doing a study like this really helps. So not just addressing a case-by-case basis with one problem happens here, and we address that, and then how's that going to affect something somewhere else. So thinking more comprehensively like that is important. So you need to be able to look at the results of this study, and also the implications of future development, and use that as a guide for annual goal setting as a means of addressing things more comprehensively. And also you need to make more of an effort in terms of actually reaching out to, making sure that multiple stakeholders come to the table, because it's not necessarily gonna be their inclination to all come together on their own to come up with a solution. So you need to facilitate these interactions, which will help bring about solutions that are more agreeable to a larger number of people together. So with that, we're going to go into some of our specific solutions and how those can be implemented.
Okay, so I know we're long on time here, and we don't have much left, and we're trying to go through this quickly. So we could probably talk for hours about every solution in here, but what we highlight is just a few of kind of the key things to do right away, and kind of based on a lot of those findings that Jared just talked about. So in that document that we gave you a copy of, we have 4 types of solutions. We have the near-term, intermediate, long-term, and specific place-based solutions. So I'm gonna focus on a couple of the near-term ones, kind of in not even that much detail, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So those are things that should be considered within a year. The rest of those, intermediate 1 to 5 years, long-term 5 or more, and the specific place-based is really like a targeted, this parking lot, you could do this near term, this in 5 years, this long term. But I do want to highlight some of those long-term ones. We put them as long-term, but they're kind of dependent on if certain things could happen. So as the riverfront meetings last week, if this were to happen, here's some options that may, if needed, fulfill some of that change in demand. Or if this were to be developed, those things might move up sooner in the timeline, but we don't want to talk about those too much. So I'm going to focus on a few of the near-term ones. And the way we look at these, we kind of look at them as near-term, but they're different kind of strategies. Some of them are management, basically how do we deal with that internally as a city, but some of them are increasing supply or decreasing demand of a space. Some of them are place-based, so some of the kind of the pedestrian type things, or landscaping. Basically, how do we make it a better experience, not just for parking, but just when somebody comes downtown. And some of them are either price-related or time-related. So go to the next one. I don't remember if we have 2 or 3 of these, but actually I think we might have 4. The first thing is creating some kind of parking commission to guide any implementation. So definitely including city staff. We have police does enforcement, public works does striping, painting, signage, development deals with zoning requirements and things like that. So bringing those 3 groups together to really evaluate the steps of implementation and discuss how do we actually put these into practice, and bringing those forward to the council to make a decision. And if it costs money, presenting those things and what that might be. That's kind of the immediate. Long-term, this could be something that really looks more though at just management, operation, long-term on an ongoing basis. So specific things that would need to be done, we outline these in much more detail, but really, as I was talking earlier when Jim kind of asked about the parking deck and making it free, what we tried to do is identify things that were at lower cost and really increasing awareness of what we already have and trying to better utilize what we already have before we go spending money on building parking decks and things like that. As we showed through a lot of data, there's a lot of occupancy available throughout downtown, so let's try and better utilize that before we go making really big drastic changes or spending a lot of money on parking decks or things like that. So a lot of on-site improvements, really good signage, clear signage. We have some examples in the upper right. Personalizing the lots. Right now, a lot of them either don't have signage or it'll just say public lot, but a lot of communities, they'll be A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, or have a specific name, like we could have all the Leopold lot, or whatever that may be.
Zach James.
Zach James lot, Jim Davidson lot.
Huh, what about me?
You gotta have a lot for Bob, man.
Mayor's lot. Bob's
No, we don't
lot.
need a mayor's, but we gotta have one for Bob.
Whoever it may be, but you get the point. Something distinctly identify
Jimmy didn't make the
what those are, instead of just saying, oh, that one at Maiden
okay.
Valley, that one at Fourth and Valley, that
Right.
one, well, there's so many on Valley, the one on Fifth and Valley, the one on Eighth and Valley. But the signage needs to be clear, the big P symbol on the front, very clear, simple signage that says, Well, you can see on the bottom left there, that's at the, off of Main Street, the parking garage. The only sign is way inside the building, it says public parking lot, then there's a very lengthy sign that, I mean, you have to stop after you pull in to really understand. So something that's simple, public, permit required, free parking or paid parking within. One other thing we talk about is painting spaces different colors to distinguish between a public space or a permit space. So you could have white spaces, permit only, yellow space, public parking. And we saw that in a couple of examples at Tumble, I think Galesburg used that as well. But, just an easy way to clearly distinguish what is public and what is, what is public and what is permit. Because as of now, there's all these little signs in there, and it's very confusing and very hard to read, so just making that clear to people.
One thing I want to mention is that you'll notice about the one next to the Burlington picture on the lower left, that's from Davenport. And one of the things I want to highlight about that is the fact that it's perpendicular to the street,
Yeah.
so it jumps right out at you. Even in some of these other pictures here, it actually has the disadvantage of being facing the other way. You really need to have something that jumps out at people as they're driving by, or else they have the potential to miss it. So that's an important thing, to just know what will catch people's attention as they're driving, because they are actively looking all around them and they have to pay attention to everything else while they're driving. So the more you can do to draw their attention to that is important.
So I mentioned the signage itself and at the lot and making it clear, but also needs to be directing them there. So the wayfinding signage and directing people where to park. The marketing materials. So we have an example on the bottom. I think that one, I can't remember if that one was the Butte or Fargo example. So that was the Butte, but we have several examples. But a clear map that tells people where the spaces are at, what's available, the enforcement policies, if it's paid, if it's not paid, what are the hourly restrictions, and things of that nature. But explaining those enforcement policies and having those available where businesses understand that, they can hand it out to customers, but having it on the website where it's available and people can read that, and clearly explaining what the enforcement policies are. So we do have some immediate things for supply changes and then better distribution of where spaces are at. So the supply changes, my personal preference is I don't like to parallel park, and there are some spots in particular on, I guess I don't know if that's a 200 or 300 block of Washington Street there, but we have a picture where there's currently a turn lane going from Washington onto Main Street, and there's some parallel parking there. Can we get rid of that turn lane and make some diagonal parking? And whenever possible in those areas, especially where there's high demand and there's parallel parking, is there enough space where we can do a diagonal? We didn't necessarily go out and measure it, but we used some GIS and kind of looked at it. It looks like it's possible in some of those places. So look at that and consider that. We talked about this earlier, but getting, or restricting those lease spaces and getting out of that mindset of, I have that space for 24 hours a day, because most of those spaces are only getting used during the day. And I like the example here at the bottom. You can't really read it very well, but it's got the big P sign on it. It has the name of the parking lot, Logan and Market, but it says permit parking, and it says 7 to 5 p.m. So you know that it's 7 to 5. After that hour, it's open to anybody. Could be free, or we could, this is what you were talking about earlier, could those then be a lease space overnight as well, or is it just free to overnight? And that's some of the things maybe we have to talk about and debate, but, and evaluate, but at least restricting that to a work day, because that's most of the usage now. And then if you look in the upper right corner, there's not as many of these. Actually, we noticed two of these have been lost in the time that we've done this study, but there are several of these 10-minute spaces just randomly placed throughout downtown that they're not restricted to a time or a day of the week, and they just say 10-minute space. We think, from what we found, that they might have been left over from previous parking meters and just never got taken away, but those are just unnecessary and they need to be eliminated. And then we talked about distribution. So some of those lots, in particular on Valley Street, actually the bottom right, there's kind of you'll see the dark orange and the light orange. That's 250 feet to 500 feet from a public parking lot. And then there's two that are in pink where there's no orange inside that black box. So there's kind of this area there where people don't have a public off-street space within 250 to 500 feet of a destination, because those are lease-only lots. So it is, let's distribute public spaces across all of these off-street lots so that we can get a better coverage for people trying to get to their destinations without having just to lease a space. Okay, next slide. I think it's the last one. And this gets into the technology. So we talk about upgrading technology for enforcement. And first is the payment method. So the current boxes that you have shown in the bottom left, there's a lot of issues with those. Number one, it creates confusion because I don't know about anybody up there, but I've never seen one of those anywhere else I've been to park somewhere. Number two, they're not really enforceable. If you go to the website where you find those, it labels them as the honor system. And basically, you're saying, I'm gonna put my money in for this space, but it ends up just collecting it in a big bucket. So you don't know who's actually paying for what space. It's basically, we expect you to pay to use that space, but we're not gonna require you to pay for it. And Jared's example, he said, where did I park today? He said, guess where I parked? And he said, the parking deck. He said he put his money in the spot, and the guy goes, why, nobody's putting your money in there. Nobody's enforcing that now anyway.
Yeah, the meter maid's done for the day.
Yeah, meter maid done for the day. So they're not enforceable. But the other issue here is then what we talked about earlier. The higher demand is on street, and this is less demand. So maybe the discussion needs to be, before we go and invest in a pay station, maybe we look at an option to make it free and see if that gets better utilization. But if we don't do that, there definitely needs to be a payment type that, number one, can be enforced, and number two, that people understand and that they've seen. Because people understand parking meters. I think people understand pay stations because they've probably seen those or used those somewhere before. And then the other thing is on ticketing, still using handwritten tickets, going back, typing them into Excel, and then sharing them with finance department and things of that nature. So trying to come up with a solution to improve technology and minimize time, handwriting, typing, where we can get a system. You can either get through a private company the handheld unit with the software, which is a little more expensive, but they'll monitor everything that way, or you can do something more in-house where you can get a tablet or a smartphone that may be a little bit cheaper and create your own basic ticketing system and then print it on a little Bluetooth printer. But the tablet or the smartphone will be able to tabulate the data, and then it's just in some kind of Excel file or something right there for you, so you don't have to go back and type them.
Actually, we're not the only city that's still doing hard copy for
No,
tickets.
you are not.
Mayberry is still doing it as well. Mayberry.
Oh, maybe,
You're a little young for that, maybe.
Muscatine? Is it Muscatine?
No, they use, I think Galesburg.
Maybe it's Gibbs. We contacted several communities to see what they do, and there are others that, including Mayberry, that still do that. So you're not the only one. I mean, other people are still doing that. I think that's it, unless you guys have questions. I apologize. We took a lot of time, but there's a lot of information, and we didn't even, I mean, there's even more stuff in there that we didn't even get into, but we wanted to give you the gist and really the data there. So some light 160-page reading.
A lot of hard work went into this, I'll tell you what, boys. Good job, good job.
Go home and study this.
All right.
If you
I know you
expect,
guys probably don't want to talk about it, but we will take
after,
questions.
after an hour and a half, you're not getting any questions.
That's fine.
All right.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
I don't
thank
have
you.
any questions, I just appreciate the
Yeah.
study, and we will get to you. Can we get you to come? And I'm sorry, Chuck, I should have rolled you first, and I wasn't, I called the wrong group.
This will only take 60 minutes.
All right, all right.
We had our consultants working on the flood mitigation project here last week. They met with various stakeholder groups in the community, and we also held 2 public meetings to get input from the community on what they want to see in the riverfront. You might know already, the first phase of construction is slated for next year in the summer. In order to put that's from the port to the auditorium. In order to put these walls in, they have to go down about 20 feet, so they're gonna tear up that whole area, and we have money to put it back about just shy of $1 million. So the thinking is, we could put it back exactly the way it is now, but we're never gonna have, or we've never had an opportunity like this to change the way that riverfront looks than we do right now. So they were taking input from these groups, from the public on what people would like to see in that area, and they have a draft consensus plan they've come up with through that series of meetings and those public meetings of different things to include, and they've come up with a riverfront trail through there, a splash pad, some green space, permanent covering for the stage by the port building. Their plan does involve moving some parking spaces in the parking lot between the port and the auditorium, so there couldn't have been a better time for this parking study to come out. And moving forward from now into the next 6 to 7 months, there's gonna be a lot of engineering design work, and then construction will start as the weather gets better.
So the stuff that came out of this last week still has to go back to the steering committee to take a look at?
Yes, and there's still some more public meetings to be had as we approach the construction time. The design for the flood walls hasn't been chosen yet. Obviously, that's very important what they look like. They'll have a large visual impact for a long time to come. So there will still be some more shortened public meetings, not another week-long process, but there's a few more things to decide.
It's one of the emails I got already. This person thinks that the plan has already been set in motion and it's already been decided, which it actually has not. So I want to make that clear. This is still a work in progress.
Yes,
Yes.
but we will be rolling next summer, which is it's gonna come quickly.
Good.
So yeah, that really wasn't an agenda item, but just thought that it was probably important to get at least a brief comment out as to where this was, because you will have stuff come back to you as a council based off of what's happened this last week, but it's just not yet.
Okay.
And if we wanna do some of the amenities like extra boat docks, a splash pad, stuff like that, we need to apply for the grants in the next couple of months to do it.
Exterior, or the boat dock, the floating dock
Yeah.
that goes on the outside.
Because we need to time that to happen with the construction of the flood wall.
Doing a good job, Charlie.
Thanks, Shane.
Okay.
You guys good?
Yep.
Thank you, sir. All right. We're gonna go right down the list here. We're gonna try to roll downhill. First is a consideration of sale and conveyance of real property, approximately 0.184 acre parcel located south of Agency Road and east of North Roosevelt Avenue. Mr. Tisland?
Guess this is probably me. This is with the Manor site, the piece of property that we were buying from the owners of the Walgreens land. This would then be the sale of that to the developer, whatever the name, Burlington Crossings. So the agreed price on that was worked out as part of the original development agreement that was done last November, December timeframe, is incorporated into it, but this specific land was not identified in the sale process when we went through that. So this is just following up on some final stages in order to allow that development to proceed.
Okay.
Any questions on that, council?
No.
The sooner the better.
Amen to that. Okay, good deal. The next one is a consideration of a permanent encroachment agreement with Downtown Partners, Inc. for encroachment into city right-of-way for the Burlington Lightscape project. Mr. Tisland.
This is, again, for the Lightscape project, which has been ongoing for quite some time, doing some fundraising for and looking to start construction here this spring on it. There are, I have a map up here of the locations, 10 locations in and around downtown that they're looking to light the steeples and prominent features primarily on churches.
It's gonna be awesome.
And they include St. Paul's Catholic Church at 508 North 4th, Christ Episcopal at 623 North 5th, First Presbyterian, 321 North 5th, First United Methodist, 421 Washington, Zion United at 402 North 5th, First Congregational at 313 North 4th, First United Church of Christ at 611 Columbia, as well as the Heritage Center Museum, the former public library at 501 North 4th, and Majestic Estates, the former German Methodist Church and Arts for Living Center at 620 Washington. So this includes placing light poles in some instances in city right-of-way, specifically for the lighting of the steeples, as well as there'll be poles and attachments at and near some of the buildings as well to light some of the various points of interest on the buildings. I do have some maps here. I can just run through each of the properties. This is Christ Episcopal, and I can probably show the image, I don't know if it'll show up on here very well, which includes 2 poles in the right-of-way on the east and north sides of the building. But I don't know how much detail you want to get into as far as the mapping or showing the detail of the property. I can just run through some of the images of the what the lighting will look like here, and then if you have specific questions. This is St. Paul's Catholic Church with 3 light poles, 1 on the south side and 2 on the west side. The Heritage Center, former public library, again, 2 light poles on the south side of the building, and then some on private property. First United Church of Christ on Columbia Street, 2 light poles on the north side of the building, and 1 on the east side of the building, with some attached to the building as well. First Congregational at 313 North 4th. This would be on the 4th Street right away on the east side of the building, lighting the front of the church. Zion United at 502 North 5th. This would be on the west side of the property on 5th Street right away. Lighting the steeple in the front of the building there. And First United Methodist, 421 Washington. This would be on the north and east sides of the building, or north and west sides of the building. First Presbyterian Church on 321 North 5th Street.
These light posts, what do they look like? How tall are they?
They range in size, I believe, from about 12 feet to 40 feet in height. Black metal pole with a small light fixture attached to the top of it. They are using the black, and maybe Steve can talk a little bit more about it, but they're not the silver metal that you see for some of the light poles out there. Trying to be a little more architectural, complementary to the buildings there.
So these light posts don't interfere with public walks and so forth?
No, we did a walkthrough, and they do have to maintain a 5-foot clearance for all pedestrian path, and then
Okay,
1
good.
foot away from the curb line, just for ADA purposes. And Ryan and I and Energy Efficient did a walk on Thursday, was it?
About 3 poles, I think, that they were gonna have to relocate just a little bit, to meet ADA compliance for, the pedestrian pathway.
Okay.
3
with the
street
next truck-
poles, 3 street poles?
Yeah, 3 of the street lights.
3 of the poles for
Sorry,
this.
3 of the light poles for this project.
I think the project's gonna be great, though.
I can't wait, I was ready
I'm
for it
looking
last year.
forward to it.
Thanks, Ryan.
Again, that was one of the requirements, was the maintaining that public way, the 5-foot clearance, and then 1 foot off of adjacent curb lines. With the encroachment, it's their responsibility to maintain the poles, and if there's damage, it's their responsibility to replace them. We did ask for the poles to have a contact placard on each pole, so that if underground utility locates, that they can contact the church or responsible party for those as well. And then, again, this is not intended to be a public or city light poles. After they're completed, they will remain property of the churches and the projects, so they'll be responsible for that going forward. And if you have any other comments or thoughts, Steve, encroachment is with Downtown Partners, kind of the lead on the project, one of the leads on the project.
I can answer answer non-technical questions. Yeah.
Do you guys have any questions for Steve?
I don't think I do.
I don't.
No questions.
All my questions got answered last year, but I think we're just, everybody's anxious to see it up. Go ahead.
As am I. We've been looking at it for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. It's a great
Good deal.
project, though.
Good
It's
deal.
gonna be good.
Okay. Next is a public hearing consideration of annual consolidated transit fund transit funding, application. Steve?
Mayor and council, this is an annual process we follow this time of year to support the funding of bus. Basically, this is requesting, there's a number in there that the formula allocates out, and it's 1.573319% of total state funding, or roughly $226,397. The formula for the federal assistance comes to $392,965. We also place a number of buses into the program should funding become available. We put 5 of our highest priority buses into the system, and that totals $658,500, and if those would all get funded, the current formula is 85%, the city's contribution would be $98,775. So there is the public hearing, it'll be next week, and the resolution supporting these numbers as well as some other pertinence that's required as part of this program. And again, it is necessary to the ongoing funding of the bus. These actually cover about 50% of the cost to operate the buses.
And don't we turn in buses every year anyways, regardless? Isn't that what we've been doing?
No.
Well, not physically, but I mean, aren't you trying to get buses? Don't you
Well, we
typically work
try
for?
every year, but right now, we're down on the funding. We might, in the next round of funding, we might have, I think we'll definitely have our oldest bus, which is like a 2001, get funded, and we've got another, we're trying to put miles so we can accumulate points. So if it goes down far enough, we might get a second bus funded based on the current ranking program.
When was the last time a bus was replaced? Or,
I've been here a little over 3 years, we haven't replaced any, so I think it's we've got a 2012, so that would be 4 or 5 years at least.
We've had it on the system to get a bus replaced every year, and it have not come to the top where our points make us eligible.
Correct.
We've only budgeted in the budget for 2. If he were to get the funding for all 5, we'd have a larger match than what we budgeted for, but I think we'd be ecstatic to get buses replaced, because we do need to get them replaced. But as he mentioned, the likelihood is it's more likely to get 1 or 2 in this next cycle. And I'd be happy to get those. Our system needs them.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Steve.
Steve.
Okay, next is motion for preliminary adoption of the second reading of an ordinance amending ordinance number 3360, being an ordinance created in the Burlington Crossing PUD Plan Unit Development by making changes to section 5E signage.
Just some minor changes to the PUD ordinance related to the Burlington Crossing PUD, allowing the common signs to be up to 50 feet in height, individual lot signs 25 feet in height, and then stating the separation distance, 20 feet between lot signs and common signs, and 100 feet between any other lot signs on the same property.
Do you guys have any questions on that?
No.
Okay, I'm good too.
If we have no comments, are you willing to waive?
I am. Council, you
Yeah.
guys good with that?
Good.
I don't see any reason not to. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, after that, we have a resolution approving preliminary official statement.
Yeah, what's that?
City manager,
I gotta change the waive second reading. I'm sorry. I was reading it and realized you guys had talked about waiving a second reading. The preliminary official statement, we're looking to, at least tentatively, the borrowing for the 1.235, I think is the number, and then refinancing one bond issue, the 2007, was it a 2007 bond? And I think it was like $3 million or something like that. Is that right? Well, Stephanie looks it up. We have to do a preliminary offering statement on that. It is a 2007 bond issue. How much? 2.2 million.
That's the 2007 bond?
Yeah, the savings on that, that's an advance refunding, is at a level that's worth considering at this point. It wasn't quite there last time when we went through this process. This year it is. The preliminary offering statement identifies those two bond issues. I put it in your reader file to take a look at. There's also language in there in terms of the current condition of the city and just the general makeup of what our background is as a community for our debt, our ability to repay this debt given the circumstances that we face. That is I mentioned to Bob when he was in earlier, that's a significant thing for you to make sure that you have reviewed that offering statement as individual council members. Every communication that is given by the city, whether it's in the cover letter to the annual budget, to this preliminary offering statement, they become more important and are reviewed at a SEC level. If you have material misrepresentation of your community in these financial statements that are given out, they can have an impact on the investors, and they take it very seriously. And if you've materially misrepresented your system, you've individually face potential liability. So you do want to make sure that we're accurately reflecting that there is an understanding that you may not catch details, but you can't materially misrepresent the condition. So it is important that you do take the time to understand what we're putting out there. You got to make sure that we're doing a good job and that you are doing a good job understanding where we currently are financially. But again, the document that was in your reader file is about 30 pages. This is that is distributed to potential investors in those the new debt and that refinancing debt. So you do need to understand what you're approving for that statement. Some of the final information was not in there. He'd anticipated that would be in tomorrow, I think is what the email said from Jostin. Most of that isn't information that, if you look at the format that's in there, is not a huge issue for you, but it is part of the final document that you do approve next week.
You guys good?
Yep.
All right. Wonderful. Hey, make sure you guys do that right, Jim. All right, next resolution awarding the contract for the 2016 Seal Coat Streets reconstruction project, right?
Okay, unlike the HMA project, I've got good news this time.
All right.
So we had the letting on April 6th for the 2016 Seal Coat Street reconstruction project. We had two bidders, W.L. Miller out of Hamilton, Illinois, and OMG Midwest, doing business as Sesford Construction Company out of Burlington. The low bid was W.L. Miller Company with a bid on crushed limestone at $330,078.04, or with the pea gravel cover aggregate of $337,447.54. With the price difference, Public Works strongly recommends that we pursue awarding a contract to W.L. Miller for the pea gravel cover aggregate. Any questions from council?
Good man, good man.
As stated in the plans, we will be doing change order with the project to come up to that budget number of $400,000. So my staff is presently reviewing a number of different Seal Coat Street options to add to that project.
Good deal.
Okay.
Hey, that's good news, Ryan.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Just wait.
Don't say that. You're supposed to say, all right. Okay, a resolution adopting the personnel manual for non-union employees.
So in your packet was the manual. This is an annual thing that we update every year. It goes in front of council to be approved to be in effect July 1st, 2016. So unlike our union contracts that go into effect and will stay into effect for 5 years, this always is updated annually. So, there's not a lot of major changes. We did have, the language change on page 1, which is Article 2, the pay plan. That was all updated with the GovHR compensation study. We accepted that study, and then I incorporated that into this manual, talking about the ranges. So those ranges that you accepted are what is in Exhibit A for this year. Basically, on page 2, salary adjustments, we have that we will follow the transition table, meaning if employees are below the midpoint of their salary range, they receive a slightly higher raise to try to, the theory behind that is to try to get the employees up to midpoint, which is the fair market value of that position, what we should be paying. If somebody is at midpoint or above, then here it's proposed that they would get the 2.25% increase. And that's that's what the union contracts are negotiated at. And if anybody has any questions, just go ahead and stop me. Also, on page 9, which is Article 7 insurance, that's been updated. That also, we match that with what the unions negotiated for employee contributions, which is 3% of the cost of single or family package, not to exceed $20 for single or $40 for family. It will all be on the same
deal.
allocation.
That's good.
So, other than that, there's not really any other changes throughout there. In language, no change in vacation or comp time or vacation, all of that. Exhibit A is what has been updated then with the salary ranges, has the new, skill level ranges on there, and then the pay grades, the 11 pay grades, so. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you.
All right. Good deal. Thank you, Steph.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, we can move to proposed consent. Does anybody have any problems with nuisance abatements?
Nope.
Okay. Resolution approving engagement letter with Piper Jaffray for 2016 AMB Geo financing.
Stephanie, do you know what to say about this? Outside of, I know that we have to do it each time we do a bond issue.
Just standard operating procedure.
We're engaging their services on the bond issue. And the second one is very much like that, as they represent our agreements or disseminate information on our behalf to the rating agencies, to the secondary market. They have to make sure that anything that's material that gets passed on and dealt with, they have to make sure they keep us on track in ensuring our audit is disseminated in the appropriate ways. And so each time we add a new issue, we have to add a new exhibit for those new issues.
Okay.
So this, as we do a new bond issue this year, we have to go ahead and amend this.
You guys good with that?
Sure.
Okay. Resolution awarding contract for the 2016 Burlington Northern Sanitary Sewer Repair Project. Do we need anything on that?
Here's the just wait part.
Yeah, we'll do this way. Okay, so in the past, it's been brought up before council that we've had a couple issues with sanitary sewer overflows near the entrance to the Hawkeye Storm Sewer. This is a project addressing both that and an upstream flooding issue that has occurred due to the construction of the Hawkeye sanitary sewer. There's a couple cleanouts in the Hawkeye Storm Sewer that create a bottleneck in that storm sewer, and it's my understanding that Brockway's been flooded, I believe it's 3 times now over the course of 10 years. They let us know once the 3rd time they got flooded. So this project is removing those couple of cleanouts to prevent that bottleneck, and we're upsizing a 12-inch sanitary sewer line that's in between 230s. Used to be part of the old regulator chamber structure for a CSO. That CSO no longer exists, and it's created an SSO situation. Originally, this was intended to not even come before council, but the quotes came in at a dollar value that required council action. The estimated cost of the project was around $38,900. The quote, single quote came in at just under $71,000. A little bit of sticker shock there in my office when we received that. When we went out for quotes, we sent it to every contractor that we would have done through a formal bidding process. Don't know if there's just lack of interest, or it's a fairly specialized work that's occurring here with the removal of those structures and the necessary shotcrete work. It's also a small project, and there's a number of unknowns. I spoke with the contractor just to get a feel for why we were so far off, and he just had a lot of concerns with unknowns, in particular in the removal of that 12-inch pipe. It's around 14 foot deep, I believe, and there's potential that there's 14 foot of flowable mortar above that, and we don't know for sure what's actually there, and since we don't know, the contractor doesn't know, and he's planning worst case scenario.
So it could be a lot lower at some point?
Right.
I don't think so.
It's unlike, I mean, it's one of those things that if through their excavation it does come up that there's nothing there, I can always ask for a change order.
It's, but it's not on a quantity basis of removal.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no, they're under no obligation to do so, out of the goodness of their heart if they want to.
And you're also saying that nobody else really wants to touch this job at the moment? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if it's the time frame we gave them or if they just don't want to touch it at all, but we only had one bidder. And we sent out to, I believe it was 12 potential contractors.
Wow.
So,
And you're okay working with this particular company? You're
um,
judging from,
I know where that question's coming from. They're presently working on the Cascade Sewer sanitary trunk extension underneath Cascade Bridge between Madison and Cascade Bridge. They've run into some troubles there, some poor project management. In general, yes, I believe that project was actually underbid on their part. The project manager there didn't really understand the scope of the project, I guess, and he's learned, and that, to be honest with you, could be part of the reason why we see the bid as high as we do is
They're trying to get some money back from when they underbid us?
potentially that, and just potentially he got himself caught on that one, and he wants to make sure that he's not gonna lose money on this one.
yeah, which is logical.
Presently, they're in liquidated damages on that project, so every day goes by, they're losing money.
So is there a timeline for completion on that?
Which project, this one or
No,
Cascade?
Cascade?
I don't have good information on
Okay.
that at this time.
I can sniff at what
They've
that
had
commission's
a
doing.
foreman change in recent weeks, and the rate of construction has increased dramatically with the new foreman on the project. So had that foreman been there from the get-go, we'd probably be done a month plus ago. I don't know if they would have made it by the December 31st deadline, but
Wow.
we'd be a whole lot closer. To answer your question, I believe this project is small enough, and the project manager there has got a good enough education on the current project that yes, their quality of work is good. It's
Okay,
just
that's-
their rate of work
That's my
the problem.
concern, the quality is, yeah, okay.
No, my project inspector on the Cascade job hasn't had any issues with quality of work, it's just rate of work has been the issue.
Okay.
Okay.
I personally don't want to see this on the consent agenda.
I would agree. I would agree.
I mean, if we're that disparate on the estimate as to what the actual is, I think
I
there's
think it
no way that
deserves
can
to-
be,
yeah.
it can't be a consent agenda.
I would totally
Well,
agree.
and with